All right, everyone, welcome to our weekly Power Lounge. This is your place to hear authentic conversations from women in digital who have power to share. My name is Amy Vaughan, and I am the owner and Chief Empowerment Officer of Together Digital, a diverse and collaborative community of women who work in digital and choose to share their knowledge, power, and connections. You can learn more about us at www.togetherindigital.com. Today, we have a very important topic to talk to all of you about. I don't know if all of you know this yet. I mean, you've tuned in, but we've got a little bit of a diagnosis for you, human giver syndrome. We're going to talk about how it affects us as women. We're going to talk about how it affects us as women at work and at home. We're going to explore the connection between human giver syndrome and imposter syndrome. For example, that kind of icky feeling you get when you reconsider charging your clients or asking for what you're worth. And why do we feel this need, this unending need to prove ourselves? Finally, we will share how boundaries can be the beginning of absolving yourself from human giver syndrome. And the woman to help empower us today is Kay. She's a business coach and advocate for family caregivers. She is on a mission to help every human set boundaries and get some rest. Just going to pause there for a minute because thank you, Kay. Kay is the author of From One Caregiver to Another, Overcoming Your Emotional Grind, and is the host of From One Caregiver to Another podcast. Everyone who happens to be a human being, oh, hey, that's all of us, is invited to join Kay's free boundaries community. Kay is a business owner, family caregiver, wife, and mom. Links to everything can be found at facilitatoronfire.net/links. Julie will also put it in the chat for us so you can all connect with Kay, check out the boundaries community. Kay, thank you for being here with us today. I am really looking forward to this conversation and this topic because the phrase human giver syndrome, as soon as it was uttered by one of our fantastic and fabulous members, Brenda, who so wonderful to introduce me to you. As soon as I heard that word, I was like, oh, there's language there for something that plays out in so many ways, and not just our careers, but our lives. So let's start with that. Human giver syndrome, if I can get it out. How did you come to know about it? And what is it?
Okay, so human giver syndrome is so it's been around for thousands of years. All right, this goes back culturally, like way longer than we have recorded history. But the term was only coined just a few years ago. It actually came out in a book called Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. It's by Kate Manne, Manne. I have a link to it on my sources page. The book is fabulous. It only came out in 2018. So we have been living with this for thousands of years. And finally, it was a philosopher. She's actually from Australia, I believe, and she's a wonderful writer. So the term came out in that book in 2018, and it's only picked up a little bit of traction since then. I think that's very fascinating because once you hear it, it's pretty clear what it is. I remember very clearly reading about the book before it came out. I was on vacation and I read an article back then in the Chronicle of Philanthropy about Kate Manne, where she talked about writing the book and having to do research for the book. So it hasn't been around very long. And if you've been sitting around blaming yourself because you should have known the term before this, actually, you should not, because it's pretty new.
Yeah.
It's also used in another book called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle.
Great book.
By the Nagoski sisters. Oh my gosh, another excellent book. Okay, so, and that one's a little more applied or practical than The Logic of Misogyny, although I highly recommend them both. So it's this cultural belief that some people exist to tend to the needs of others, really to make other people more comfortable. So it's to make other people more successful and happier and experience less discomfort in the world. It does tend to break out along gender lines or along gender norms. I mean, I don't like to necessarily break things down that neatly because I don't think that's the way the world works. But you are going to find that more women will identify with the term. As far as I know, there hasn't been any real research into it yet. Surprise, surprise. But as best we can tell anecdotally, it really does tend to apply more to either people who were raised as females
Mhm.
or who now identify as female,
Mhm.
although that's not the only case. So when the way Kate Mann coined the term, you've got the human givers. And this isn't something that we choose, by the way.
Mhm.
Like, I did not come into the world desiring to be the one who was supposed to serve other people.
Yeah.
Right. I was designated to be that. And that is the case for many, many of us who find ourselves as these givers. Kate Mann explains it that they're givers and then they're human beings. And those are the people who just get to live their lives. I think that's pretty powerful. Again, I don't find that to be the breakout to be quite so tidy
Right.
that way. Because there's a lot of categories of different ways humans interact together in this world. But basically, that's what human givers are. It's our job. And this just shows up everywhere in our lives. It's, I mean, used to be more so the career choices that we would make.
Mhm.
Certainly shows up in motherhood.
Mhm.
And look, I would love someday to be able to use the term parenthood. I just don't think we're there yet. I still think there's a big difference
Yeah.
in most cases
Uh-huh.
between fatherhood and motherhood. I
Absolutely.
would like for that to change, but
Yeah.
we're working on it. It shows up, this one is so hard, in the way that we are supposed to appear certain ways to make
Mhm.
other people more comfortable.
Mm.
The way we're not supposed to take up space, we really ought to be slender. We really ought to do this, that, or the other, because
Mhm.
there's a lot of research about how you get ahead if you look more attractive and all of that. But really the expectation there is that we are making other people comfortable with our own appearance.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just shows up just everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, in fact, I want to let you know, I was listening to your podcast episode on the Bill of Rights for Women at Work.
Uh-huh.
And we wouldn't need that if it
Yeah.
weren't for human giver syndrome. I mean, we don't
Right.
need a Bill
So
of Rights
true.
for men at work,
Yeah.
right? We need a Bill of Rights that covers traditionally underrepresented populations,
Right.
women, anybody whose skin is not white,
Mhm.
anybody whose gender is maybe more fluid.
Mhm.
These are the people who I
Yeah.
find identify much more with the term human giver syndrome. And
Oh,
I also have to tell
absolutely.
you that people who don't identify with it often
Uh-huh.
are very confused by it.
Huh.
Because if you're on the receiving end of that altruism,
Right?
you're like,
Yeah.
what's the big deal?
Right.
I don't understand. What's the big deal? Because if it's working out really well for you,
Yeah.
why would you want to understand it?
Oh, this is all like, it's all very enlightening. It's breaking my brain. It's making me feel seen and it's making me angry, but it's all good. I'm sure
I know,
all
it
of our
kind of gets you
listeners are
like
there
right
with
here,
us.
doesn't it? You get
Yeah.
this sort of, I don't know if it's anger or disappointment or, like me, if you just want to have justice in the world, like, I just want to make this better
Yeah.
for everyone.
Yeah. Well, and it's a bit of shame too, knowing that I think a lot of us, especially women within, our organization and whatnot, like to think that we are independent free thinkers and we don't have to succumb to the systems that society has kind of built around us and fall prey to not being a human being, but being a human giver. I think that is so striking. And that one hurt because it's like, it's a great question to begin to ask yourself in a moment where you have a choice. One, actually acknowledge that you have a choice. Oftentimes we don't do that. But once you've acknowledged that you have a choice, say, am I going to come at this as a human being or as a human giver?
Yeah.
And there's a time and place for both. But
There's a
how
time and
often do
place
we
for
just
both.
choose?
And what I want to emphasize is the idea that this is a syndrome.
Mhm.
I'm looking right into the camera as I say this. This does not mean there's something wrong with you. This is not a
Right.
syndrome that's on your shoulders. We're going to
Mhm.
talk about imposter syndrome in a minute, and that's exactly the same way.
Right.
This is something that has been put on us. So this is like a syndrome in terms of our culture.
Yes.
That's a lot to bear.
That is. That is. And I think it does come across in so many ways too. I loved how you framed it as a lot of times even our choices and behavior to make others comfortable. And that comes across in a million ways too, right? As we consider how we look on the outside, as we age, how we show up in a room, even, to make others more happy, to make others more comfortable. Are there any other ways that you can kind of give us or show us either common or not so common signs of human giver syndrome? Sort of like if you're sitting in this place and you're like, okay, yeah, this is me. Maybe there's a few people out there going, I don't know, maybe this isn't me. What are some other common or not so common signs of human giver
Well,
syndrome?
so it is something that we internalize as well as something that comes at us from
Right.
outside of us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one example that I can give you, and this is so funny, you talk about aging. I started letting my hair go gray.
Yeah.
I'll say letting it go gray about 10 years ago because it tried to go gray a lot earlier than that. And I
Uh,
colored it for a while.
yep.
And for a long time, I was doing a lot of public speaking. This was before the pandemic. It was before my business model changed.
Mm-hmm.
And ugh, every time I would be out in public, a lady would come up to me in the bathroom and say, I just think it's so brave of you to let your hair go gray. And I thought, what the heck is going on there?
Is that a compliment? I don't know what to think of that.
And I don't really want to be known for courage for
Yeah.
what my hair looks like because I just
Right.
decided to stop coloring it.
Exactly.
And oh, I could never be that brave is another thing that people said. I thought, what is going on here? But
Yeah.
now that I work so much with human giver syndrome, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I get it. It kind of is brave to fly
Yeah.
in the face of all those cultural norms. I'll say
Mm-hmm.
another way that this shows up a lot for women, since our audience today is mainly women, is like if you find yourself stuck in perfectionism,
Yes.
that's 100% me. That is my poison.
Mm.
I relate to that. My whole life. People pleasing
Yeah.
is another one. And what's going on there is we do have this expectation that people around us that that we will not inconvenience them.
Mm-hmm.
That by either being more perfect or by doing everything for them, that we're going to make their lives easier and more convenient.
Mm.
And it can be really crippling. I mean, for a
Yeah.
long, long time, my perfectionism was crippling. I can even
Yeah.
feel it right now when I think back to the way that used to control me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that looked like people pleasing to a lot of people around me, but
Yeah.
I know from my own motivation, that's not what it
Mm-hmm.
is. For me, it's more perfectionism.
Mm.
Um, and that's the idea that I just always have to look like I'm doing the right things.
Yeah.
That is 100% about the way I'm going to be perceived to
Mm-hmm.
make other people more comfortable. This
Mm.
is so frustrating and aggravating.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I inherited it. I can look
Yeah.
back across the generations of women who I knew, and I can
Mm-hmm.
see exactly what was going on and where this
Yeah.
comes from.
Yeah, it's definitely a learned behavior. What I love about this too is it unlocks that aspect of our tendency towards certain behaviors and perfectionism. And I think understanding what's motivating you in those moments is like the first step in self-awareness to start to course correct, which we'll talk about all that here in a few minutes. But outside of societal conditioning from a gendered standpoint, we'll talk plenty more about that here in a few minutes. I also believe that one of the biggest factors of so many of us being in this kind of human giver syndrome that you started to get to is generational. A lot of us are in what's called the sandwich generation, which just means we're adults who are living with parents that are over the age of at or above 65 while raising children under 18. So we're supporting our aging parents while also raising young children, and we're being pulled in multiple directions. When you're working with your clients and within your caregiver communities, I'm just curious, like, do you sort of feel like that tends to be the case? Do you see a lot of sandwich generation? And more importantly, what advice would you have for this group? Because I feel like that's a good number of not just our listeners here, but our community base at Together Digital.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find most for the people in the sandwich generation, and I'm in the sandwich generation. I mean, my mom lives on the property with us. She lives
Mm-hmm.
in a granny flat right next door to us.
Yay.
So she's off of our garage. Um, is we think that kind of pressure to care for people who are both older and younger than us,
Mm-hmm.
we just think that's normal. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the air we breathe. We all of a sudden, an elderly parent needs our help, or maybe an aunt, or somebody who's like
Yeah.
family is what
Mhm.
happens. And of course, that's what we're supposed to do. I actually did a podcast episode, I think it was a couple of months ago, and it was just, the answer to the question, do I have to let my in-laws move in?
Mm,
That is a question that I get a lot
I
from
bet. Yeah.
people. My mother-in-law or my father-in-law, or both of them, are slowing down,
Mhm.
and my husband says they should move in with us. What do we do now? And most of us would not stop to say, hang on a second. I think we missed a whole part of the conversation there, which is, what are the other options first before we
Mhm.
entertain having in-laws move in?
Mhm.
We think that this stuff has all been predetermined. One of the things that I talk about a lot is how, with being a caregiver, you step into that role of being a family caregiver,
Mhm.
and it's like you're opening a chapter of a book in your own life that somebody
Mm.
else wrote ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a great description. That's so
I
true.
think motherhood can be like that too. I've
Mhm.
seen some of that change. My oldest is 20, and I've seen some of that change, but
Yeah.
it's like, wait a minute, don't I get a choice here about how
Right.
we're going to do this? And most people think that you don't.
Mhm.
And it's really important to remember that you do have a choice, that even though human giver syndrome says that you're supposed to feel guilty if
Mhm.
you talk about your own needs, we have to be willing to have that conversation,
Mhm.
even just with ourselves, or maybe with your therapist, or maybe if you're working with
Mhm.
a coach like me.
Yeah.
That's a really hard conversation to say. I'll
Mhm.
say to my clients often, well, what do you need? They don't even know how to
Yeah,
answer,
I was gonna
because
say, I
we're
was deer in headlights, like, "What? Somebody's asking me? Oh, crap, I don't have an answer."
total deer in headlights. So, that's the first part, is what do you need? And
Yeah,
I'm not even saying to start by articulating that to other people.
sure.
Just start
Ask
figuring that out for
yourself,
yourself. The
right?
next thing is probably, don't be isolated.
Mhm.
Oh, find a community. I mean, find Together Digital. Find a community of people where
Mhm.
you don't have to be alone, because we're also taught that we have to hide how difficult this is, how mentally and physically
Yes.
draining this is,
Mhm.
and how it can feel like you completely lose your own identity.
Yeah.
And that isolation, I find that to be kind of exponentially repeating cycle. Like, you get isolated and then you just keep getting more and more isolated. So
Mhm.
don't be isolated, find a way to get yourself out of
Yes.
that.
Mhm.
Now, here's the thing about that, I mean, it's like none of this stuff is easy, but it just keeps getting harder, because the way to get yourself out of isolation,
Mhm.
brace yourself, is to ask for help.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, and then to receive that help.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
I wish I could make it easier. I wish I
Yeah,
could make it less painful.
right.
This stuff is really hard. It makes a
Mhm.
huge difference, but you have to do it. We aren't taught to do that. It's
No.
never modeled to us. We
Mm-mm.
certainly are not encouraged to do that,
Yeah.
because when we pretend to be independent,
Mhm.
and when we go about trying to prove ourselves
Yeah.
all the time, it really does make everybody else's life easier.
Yeah.
Actually, that's an important frame here for human giver syndrome. I've actually tried to start using the term human giver system,
Oh, okay.
because, wow, does that pinpoint the actual problem? It's
Mhm.
not just that people have all these expectations of us, is that they're hundreds of billions of dollars. Probably most of our economy
Mhm.
is built on this altruism
Yeah.
of the givers, of the
So
people who
true.
just
All the
suck it
free
up.
work,
All
all
the
the
free,
free work, all
all
the
the free
invisible
work.
free work that you women are doing, just
And
telling you at
that is
home,
the human
at
giver
work.
system,
So
right?
true.
Like, and I even have a recent example of this. My younger son
Mhm.
was on crutches for a few weeks. He hurt his leg running. But the doctor's office made an appointment, a follow-up appointment for him, without
Mhm.
checking with me about what time we could get him there.
Interesting.
That's the
Okay.
human giver system. Like, oh,
Yeah.
he's got a chauffeur. It'll be fine.
Right?
He'll be able to
No
find, like,
problem.
he's 15. He can't drive yet. So somebody has to drive him. And I find that with my mom's doctors as well,
Yeah.
is nobody checks with me
Yeah.
before they make appointments. And that's the
Mhm.
human giver system.
Right. That's such a great point. And there's such a a point in which we ought to be allowed to grieve. Especially if you're going through the motions of becoming a caregiver of an aging parent. No, it's so funny. When you're a teenager, you swear someday it's like, oh, someday I'm going to tell you what to do. And then the day that you have to, you're like, I really don't want to do this. So it is it's a difficult emotional time. And like you said, we don't model it. We don't see it. We don't talk about it. It is invisible work. Or if we do talk about it, it is seen as, oh, wow, that's so great of you. What a good son, daughter you are, you know?
So there's this thing we say to caregivers. It just makes me want to puke.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you should get some help so you can be a better caregiver.
Oh,
Look,
that makes me want to.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with that fundamentally. I mean, if you're in a caregiver role, it's probably a good idea to want to be the best you can, right?
Yeah.
But I deserve help because I'm a human.
Right.
I have a friend who's a physical therapist, and I think she's in Saudi Arabia right now. And we were talking some time ago. And she said to me, I work with a lot of caregivers, and I've been trained to say, what do you need physically so that you can get back to your caregiver duties?
Yeah, that's great. That's a wonderful way to frame it up.
I mean,
It makes such a big difference.
Not, what do you need so that you can get back to your life?
Right.
But let's get you back to being a caregiver. I'm like, I'm here. I'm a whole person. I'm still sitting here.
Not just that. Yeah.
There's 53 million of us just in the US, and
Mhm.
we're all getting this to some degree.
Yeah, I agree. We had a question in the chat from the live audience. I want to make sure we throw it in because we were just
Sure.
discussing, you framed up that example of, in-laws moving in. What if you are the caregiver and you don't want to see your family member put into a home or assisted living per se, but you also don't want them to live with you? Like, how do you even begin to cross that bridge?
Okay. I really, really love that question, because what you have to know is that there are 50 other things between living with you and living in a home.
Mhm.
There really are so many other options, whether they live nearby, whether they live far away. There can be paid help. There's any number of ways to help people. Somebody could move into an apartment. There's, whatever. But the important thing is to have this conversation and to stop skipping over all of the steps that could be in between.
Yeah.
My parent is failing in some way, and either they have to come live with me or they have to go to a home. That is absolutely not true. Those are the two most common things that you're going to hear about, probably from healthcare providers and mostly from everybody else. Because, and again, I'm going to say this again, this is what makes everybody's life more convenient. If you step in and choose one of those options, that's just easiest for everybody else. So it really is better for them. So I don't think people do this necessarily because they're jerks or they want to make things harder for
Yeah.
us. But that really is the most convenient way. Those are the systems that are already set up. And it's like a meat grinder where we get ground up in the process. So really the thing to say is, hang on, this is a much bigger conversation.
Yes.
Let's start talking about everything that could possibly be available. And including mental health options for your parents.
Yes.
One of the things that I see a lot of, I mean a lot of, is we let all of our family members off the hook in terms of their own mental health. I mean, look, people have mental health problems. I myself was diagnosed with depression like decades ago, right? Mental health is a real thing, but we're also all adults. Even if you're in a situation where the family member you're caring for has dementia, that person is literally the only person who doesn't have full emotional functioning.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you've got a sibling who refuses to participate or refuses to get mental health help or whatever is going on, that person is still an adult, and you're allowed to say, we're adults. We have to both be adults here. So we really do, because of family dynamics. Family dynamics is really hard. I have a bajillion stories. You got to listen to my podcast. I tell a lot of them there, but adulting is hard.
Yeah.
And you don't
It
have to be
is.
the only one to bear the burden of the
No.
adulting.
Yes,
Even if you're the
100%.
only child
Hmm.
or the only niece or
Right,
whatever,
right.
there are still other people in the world. This is where I just say again, don't be isolated.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It outside of like the emotional shifts and things that, I mean, I really wasn't expecting to feel or experiencing all of that in isolation, outside of limiting your purview to options in the way of what's in between at a home or living in my house. Like, there are so many options, and there's not a lot of easy resources to find what potential options and solutions might be. All right, let's get back to a minute, because we could have a whole ass conversation for a whole nother hour about caregiving and caregivers. I want all of our members who are listening to know we do have a caregivers channel on Slack. If you're not there yet, it is a great place, a safe space to ask your questions, to share the resources that you have found helpful, because it is such a interesting journey and point in all of our lives at some point, if we're lucky enough to have our parents that long, that we're going to go through. And, I think it's something that I would love to hear and see more of us talk about, hence the channel. Earlier, we talked about societal conditioning. How do you see this sort of leading to human giver syndrome
Oh, the societal
for girls
conditioning.
specifically?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, for girls, for people who are raised as females, we are taught that we are supposed to be responsible for other people's feelings. Okay. And I think that this all comes back to human giver syndrome is where this comes from. So humans don't work that way. I cannot reach inside of you, Amy, and make you feel something. All right. So
Mhm.
sensations are different. Like I could kick you in the shin and you would feel pain, but we actually cannot cause emotions in someone else.
Yep.
I don't want to oversimplify this. Emotions are very complicated, but the
Mhm.
belief that your action can cause a
Yep.
feeling in someone, and like the one I remember
Uh-huh.
is when I was really little, I can remember being on the playground, probably kindergarten, and there was a little boy who was touching my hair. And I
Mhm.
can remember the teacher saying, just let him touch your hair. You don't want to hurt his feelings. That's a,
Okay.
so, I mean, that really gets into boundaries, but at the same
Yeah.
time, what we are being taught from the time that we are very, very tiny, particularly
Mhm.
as girls,
Yep.
is that we are responsible for the way that people around us feel,
Mhm.
and that's bull. We just don't work that way. This has been relevant actually during the pandemic when my two
Yeah.
boys were home with me for the first 9 months of the pandemic. We had a lot of long talks about about how frustrating it was for us to be together and how the situation was difficult
Mhm.
and who was going to be responsible for whose feelings. And I can remember saying to my kids, you know, I am very angry right now, and I am angry because you behaved this way.
Mhm.
My anger is not your fault.
Mhm.
I will tell you what, if you will take responsible for your behavior,
Yeah.
I will take responsibility for my feelings,
That's
and we
fantastic.
can have those conversations. And that really eased up the pressure on
Yeah.
us a lot.
Mhm.
Um, is just to correct for these misbeliefs that we were raised with. I have this dream that we'll start talking about emotional responsibility and emotional intelligence
Yeah.
with kids when they're 2 and 3 years old.
Yes, right.
Because
Teach them
I
young.
went, probably 45 years,
Yeah.
and some of that was time that I was spending doing self-awareness
Mhm.
work and going to therapy and working with
Right.
coaches and all of that
Mhm.
before I was able to really internalize this idea that I'm
Yeah.
not responsible for the way people feel.
Yeah. Another great example that Julie threw into the chat, who's listening with us, is school dress code, right? And then Brenda, this is going to make you cringe too. Just give your great uncle a hug. It just makes my skin crawl. Like,
Uh,
not establishing and helping young women, and I say girls at the beginning because that's really where it starts.
Yeah.
um, Giving them language, giving them tools, helping them, exemplify what boundaries look like, giving them the option to choose boundaries in itself are, I think, some really great ways, which is why I wanted to ask the question. It's not just about dredging up and saying, oh, all as women, we have all these things. It's just like, I want even our allies and men who are listening to understand that there are certain times and places in which, regardless of parent or gender, that we are perpetuating this human giver syndrome, and we think it's harmless, but it's in the fact that we're like, well, you can't dress that way because it's going to make the boys feel a certain way. Again, I love that you're just like, that's the boundary. I am not responsible for the way that you feel about my actions.
Let me give
That's
you
so
an
freeing.
example that we hear all the time that just makes me want to jump out of my skin. Adult language here. I mean, it's not that adult. But one phrase that we hear all the time is resting bitch face.
Yeah.
And that is gendered language that is
so
very
annoying.
much, oh my gosh, it's along the same lines of you need to smile more.
Yep.
But it's basically telling women that whatever we are doing with our faces is causing other people to feel certain reactions.
Yep.
And we don't use a ton of, swear words in my house. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't bother me, but I always say to my family, like, get a better vocabulary.
Mhm.
But we don't use resting bitch face anymore because it's so gendered. And so this cracks my kids up. The term that we use now is resting asshole face. Because, that's not gendered. I heard one the
Yeah.
other day that I thought was really good too, which was resting business face.
Yes, I've heard that one.
Which is very neutral
Awesome.
and very
Yep.
appropriate, but we simply have to look around and learn to notice what's
Mhm.
really going on. These are the things to do. And I'll tell you what, I didn't come up with that response to the term
Mhm.
resting bitch face overnight. I realized it bothered me. It
Mhm.
probably took me a couple of years
Yeah.
to really get to the bottom of why it bothered me so
Yeah.
much. And, I don't have a quick wit, right? It took me a while to come up with this language, this script that I use
Mhm.
now to say to people, this is why we don't use this phrase.
Yep.
And now I just use that script whenever I need to. And that's a big part of the work of boundaries
Yeah.
too, is, giving yourself words that you can
Mhm.
use in uncomfortable situations.
Yeah. And I love it too, because you're teaching your boys that. And I think that's tremendous.
Yeah, I got
Tremendous.
another story, and I won't go into it here,
No,
but
you're
when
fine.
they were younger, they were fighting in the front yard,
Mhm.
and one of them, punched the other one and said, "You fight like a girl." And I just very briefly, I just walked up and grabbed them both by the collar, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, "If you say that, you better mean it, because what do girls fight like?"
Right?
So we just don't, just since they
Yeah.
were little, and I didn't
Yeah.
even know back then what it was really that I was doing. I just knew it made me
Mhm.
mad.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we do such a good job in the kind of the process, or the living in the space that is human giver syndrome. Those things that gnaw at you, it's so easy for us after a while to not become immune, but just to diminish those feelings of frustration and anger or discomfort when we hear or we see something. It would always gnaw at me when we would do like internal office awards, and every time a woman was chosen, they would read a paragraph full of accolades, and at the end they would always say, 90% of the time, I like took stats because it was driving me so bonkers, 90% of the time in the course of just a few months, and she did it with a smile. And I
Oh,
finally stood up and I was like, listen, friends, can somebody please explain to me why we have to end every accolade for a woman with, and she did it with a smile? Like, what the hell did that have to do with her ability to be successful in what she did? And
okay.
if it's important, then why don't we say it when we accolade the dudes too?
Well, it's human giver syndrome, but should we talk about imposter syndrome now?
We
Like, is
absolutely
that the
should.
segue to imposter syndrome, is
We
talking about
absolutely should.
okay. So here's the thing. We have been taught to think about imposter syndrome as something that's wrong with us.
Mhm.
And just like human giver syndrome, I'm telling you, I think it's something that we have inherited because it makes other people more comfortable. Because if we're kind of one step behind, if imposter syndrome holds us back because we're just a little reluctant to step up,
Yeah.
other people get to be ahead faster and be more comfortable.
Mhm.
So, let's look at a specific thought. So, Amy, I'm going to ask you, and I'll
Yeah.
say everyone who's watching too, what's a belief that you have around imposter syndrome? Or you think, if I have imposter syndrome, this is something that I believe, or this is something that I think.
I mean, I have two very conflicting feelings on the note of what we just discussed, in that sense of something that feels icky, wrong, and off. When I hear it, it makes me mad because I want to believe that it's not a thing that exists. It's something that we impose upon ourselves and others, explaining away what is self-doubt and just a messy, messy ball of other societal like conditioning expressing itself in the form of us second guessing ourselves. So it definitely puts me in the space of anger, which is interesting for an Enneagram type 9, if you're familiar with those folks.
Oh, are
I'm
you a
like,
9? Okay.
oh, I'm totally a 9.
Okay.
And so, but the other thing is that it's just still very much a part of my day, regardless of, you know, whatever it is that I'm able to do or achieve, but I'm definitely getting better at it. So to me, imposter syndrome is just a constant work in progress of me learning how to trust myself, and hearing when I hear self-doubt, acknowledging it, asking what's behind it, and then moving on. But there's still mornings where I'll wake up and it's like, why am I doing this? Why am I the person to do this? Should I be hosting a podcast? Who the hell wants to listen to Amy talk anyways? And yet here you all are, and you listen, and a lot of you listen every week.
Okay. So
So
there's a pretty common thought. Well, I don't have anything to say that anybody would want to hear.
I hear that from a lot
Okay.
of women, especially.
All right. So I think what's really happening now, first of all, let me validate that. If you have that thought in your head, if that feeling is in your heart,
Mhm.
that is 100% real for you, and that is going on. I also think we've been taught to do that. I don't think that most of us, not even the 9s, came out of the womb thinking nobody's going to want to hear what I have to say.
Mhm.
We know that's true because there are many people groups, usually men, who are not taught to say that, and for whom, you know, they're probably sympathetic to imposter syndrome, and there may be times that they go through it,
Mhm.
but it's not like the air they breathe. We
Right.
are taught that for us, imposter syndrome, believing nobody's going to want to hear what I have to say anyway, or
Yep.
maybe, and I've got a list here myself. I'm not good enough
Mhm.
is another one. I don't deserve this.
Mhm.
I'm not worthy of this. So when we think those things, what happens is there's enough of a pause there, whether it's a few seconds or years. Somebody else can step into the space that we would have filled. So what we did was
Mhm.
we just made room for somebody else to live into their full potential
Yeah.
while we're back here doubting ours. So what I see is that
Mhm.
imposter syndrome and human giver syndrome are very much tied together. I think
Absolutely.
human giver syndrome is probably like the umbrella, but I think
Mhm.
they're very tied together. And I think the more we can learn to name this and name that it's going on and understand the dynamic, the better chance that we're going to have of saying,
Mhm.
like for me, this I'm not good enough is another one.
Mm.
And also nobody wants to hear what I have to say. The process for me has become, ugh, I'm thinking that thing again. That's a thing that I think.
Mhm.
Okay, no problem. I don't have to choose it.
Right.
I can choose another thought
Yes.
to live from today.
Yes.
That's
That's
a
so
but I
true.
mean, that's like everyday work
It is. It
for me.
absolutely is. And it plays so nicely and neatly into things which I see happening, especially in my circle of like women friends throughout Together Digital, outside of Together Digital, are things like affirmations. You know, that's just us trying to work ourselves out of the default of what has been crammed into our brains, to our hearts, and to our minds for as long as we've been alive, and in finding other outlets and ways in which we can take control of those thoughts. I love telling my daughter, just because you think something doesn't make it true. So when it's the voice of doubts, or it's, you know, it's imposter syndrome, just because you think you're, you know, whatever, doesn't mean that that is the case. And then using the yet as well, giving yourself time and space to say, okay, maybe I'm not the best singer in the world yet, but there's lots that you can do to go out there if that's really your passion, that's really your purpose, to get what you need, to become what you need, to fulfill that space that you want. Because I think this also ties nicely into, I wanted to talk for a minute about how human giver syndrome can truly impact our careers, because so many women feel like, you know, when I talk to them, they're leaving a job because they feel like there's a lack of growth or there's no opportunities for them. How does human giver syndrome start to play out in our careers?
I mean, I think that in a lot of places there really is no room for advancement if you're not in the
It's
group
true.
that's in power, because the,
Yeah.
the people who tend to bear the burden of human giver syndrome are the ones who are not in power.
Yep.
Often that's women, lots of other
Middle management.
underrepresented groups, right? Lots of other underrepresented groups
Yes.
could step up here and say, me too. And you'd be right. I'm not excluding
Mhm.
anybody from this conversation. Um, One thing in particular that happens, oh my gosh, and I just like, if this has ever happened to you, I want to reach through the airwaves and hug you.
Mm.
It's when somebody takes credit for your work,
Mm. Yep.
or when you've been taught to give credit to
Mhm.
other people for your work. Well, then
Mm.
what happens is they get credit for your work and their careers move forward,
Yeah.
and they climb the ladder, and we get stuck sitting in the corner, if we even have a seat at the table,
Yep.
basically with a muzzle on,
Mhm.
because what's happened over time is we have started to think that it's the way it's supposed to be, that
Yeah.
somebody else gets credit for our work. And I can
Mhm.
remember, I mean, I've been on my own now in my own business since 2015, but I can remember, even just the year before that, sitting around a table, being the most experienced one at the table
Yep.
and having to raise my hand and say, I, I have this, what you think happened did not happen. And I was the one who started the conversation.
Yeah.
Like, guys, people, we need to actually face what's gone on here. And
Mhm.
gosh, and I can even remember the body language, the
Yeah.
signaling that I was getting from the people around the table. And I can picture their faces too, to try to get me to shut up, to try
Yep.
to get me to stop talking, because
Yep.
I simply wasn't willing to have a conversation that wasn't based in fact.
Yeah.
And I thought this is so ridiculous. And it had played out so many times in
Mhm.
my life and in my career up to that.
Yep.
And it makes people very uncomfortable.
Yep. Because
And
you know what they say about you, Kay? Do you know what they said about you after that conversation? I
you
already know
tell
because I
me,
used to
you
get
tell
called
me.
all the time. She's really intimidating.
I'm sorry.
I find her intimidating.
She's a lot.
Yeah, she's a
She's
lot
a
to handle.
she's
Like
a
she's just
lot to handle.
emotional.
Do we really need to have her in? Oh, she's emotional. That one drives me crazy. Do we really need to have her in these meetings?
Right?
Because I feel like she brings up things that we don't need to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, as the most experienced one in the room, my
Mhm.
voice counts. My
Right.
voice gets to count.
Yeah.
Um,
But it's such
and
a great example to show you, like you said, when people call you a name, such as, or describe you in a way that isn't, it's all it's doing is it's putting an exclamation point on the discomfort that they are feeling
yeah,
about the things that you said. It has, and again, you're not responsible for them responding to the way that they did about things that you said that were truths, for you. It's just so funny.
I think one of the things that we spend a good chunk of our careers doing, oh, who am I kidding? A good chunk of our lives doing is proving ourselves to people.
Mhm.
And I think there's a really, really important reason for that. When when you have been designated to be a human giver,
Mhm.
right? I just want to bring this up again. Most of us did not choose this designation. It was
Right.
thrust upon us.
No.
One of the things that goes along with that is that you've been taught that your worth and value is related to the way you serve other people.
100%.
And so we go around acting like we have to prove ourselves,
Mhm.
because if we are trying to do things for ourselves, like for my career, for my personal advancement, to save for my retirement,
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about my husband's retirement. I want to talk about my retirement. I have to prove that I actually am allowed to hold space in the universe for myself as a
Yep.
separate person, and not as I'm related
Mhm.
to other people and the way I
Yep.
serve other people.
Mhm.
And I have been guilty of this my whole life, going
Yeah.
around trying to prove myself.
Mhm.
I didn't understand the dynamic. I didn't understand why I was doing it. I
Mhm.
didn't understand why I've been so dismissed
Yep.
and brushed off
Mhm.
and gaslit by the
Mhm.
people around me for most of my life.
Yep.
And it's because they don't think necessarily that I have as much value in the world if I'm not serving somebody
Yep.
else. And I believe that too.
Yep.
And honestly, it makes me want to cry because I
Yeah.
don't believe it anymore. But I look
Mhm.
back across my life, I've got
Oh, yeah.
so many decades of that kind of walking around
Yeah.
being a difficult person, waving my hand saying, hey, I'm here,
Right.
simply because I didn't understand that we all have inherent self-worth.
Yeah.
We all have a right to space and to
And
be
what does
ourselves.
all of that constantly striving to prove ourselves and our worth in the world constantly to everybody kind of lead to? Okay.
Yeah. Burnout.
Hello.
Is that where we were going? Burnout?
Yep.
Yeah.
You got it. Ding, ding, ding,
Yeah.
ding. I
It
mean,
takes so much energy, doesn't it?
right. And people wonder that, and it's so funny, but we will peg it on one thing. I am so burnt out because work, because family. But that's just the surface of what you're thinking about when you're talking about burnout. Again, like, nobody, if we aren't responsible for how other people feel, nobody else is responsible for how we feel. And so when we give ourselves away through human giver syndrome over and over and over again, to the point that it's detrimental to our career, to our mental health, our physical health, our relationships, yeah, it's no wonder we're all sitting around going, oh God, I'm so burnt out. And we peg it and we pin it, in my opinion, on the wrong things. And we think it's everything external and nothing internal. And that's why I love this notion of really taking a look at ourselves and saying, how have I been conditioned? How am I falling in prey to being a human giver versus a human being? And just not allowing myself time and space to be. Because when you let yourself have time and space to be, all of a sudden, burnout's not quite such a thing, because also with that comes boundaries, which is the next thing I want to get to, because I feel like everybody who's listening, I'm sure you all, I hope at some point or another, and I've been seeing lots of comments in the chat, we all realize we're guilty of this, that we fall into this trap. We've been conditioned from whatever reasons. It's inherent within us for so many reasons. What are some boundaries that we can start to put into place so that we can begin to start to overcome all of this icky side effects, but most importantly, stick with those boundaries? It's kind of like what you said earlier about help. Sometimes we make that jump to finally ask for help, and then we don't take it. How do we create some boundaries, Kay, and then stick to them?
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't want to give, boundaries we should all have, because I don't like lumping everybody together.
Sure.
And in fact, I want to back up a couple of steps, because what everyone needs to know, oh, this is so hard. And look, when I start talking about boundaries, I think people want to slide under their desks. I just think people don't want to talk about it because it feels so hard, and we feel guilty because we've gone our whole lives without doing it. Here's the thing. Every human has a right to boundaries. It is a human right, and it belongs to you and to me, no matter what our circumstances are, no matter what your relationships look like, no matter what your career is. I know this can be really hard to hear, because many of us have been in situations where we've been conditioned to believe that other people get boundaries, but we don't get to have boundaries. And that's not true. We all have a right to understand what the expectations are that are being placed upon us, and to choose boundaries that are right for us. So the definition of boundaries, real quick, this is a two-parter. The first part of it is just making decisions about what's okay with you and what's not okay with you, and what you're going to do when those things happen. Usually we have to make these decisions because something has happened we don't like. The second part of that definition then is communicating that to people when necessary. And I always say, I'm sorry, I wish I could remove that second part for you.
Right.
But I can't, you don't always have to communicate boundaries, but when you do, you need to be able to do that. And because it's never been modeled for us, we haven't been told that we have a right to do this. I think the most important thing to understand is that as you begin to kind of dip your toe into the waters of setting boundaries, it is just as hard as it seems. You will take one step forward and one step back, or two steps back. You will set a boundary and somebody will completely misunderstand. You will set a boundary and then you yourself will forget the next time it comes up. And so then you go around feeling ashamed because you set a boundary and you yourself didn't enforce it. What I want to let everybody know is this is really, really normal. Okay. Relationship dynamics are really hard. It's very difficult to retrain your brain to do things differently than you always have. And particularly with something like boundaries, where when you start to talk about boundaries and you can like feel that in your body. I'm sure some of you listening are having kind of a body reaction now. Something gets a little warm or you feel it in the pit of your stomach or whatever.
My palms aren't sweating.
Yeah, neither am I. No sweat in my armpits. Those things, we have trained ourselves to react in those ways. And so it is a process of retraining yourself to give yourself a little bit of a pause. Oh, what happened here? Did I like the way I reacted? Oh, I didn't like the way I reacted. Could I choose something differently next time? Can I practice a
Yes.
script? And I just did 2 podcast
Love that.
episodes about holidays and
Uh-huh.
reducing stress by setting
Yes.
boundaries. The episode this week was I actually gave 3 scripts and 3 scenarios that you can literally use when things get difficult. And I really give a lot
That's
of context
fantastic.
there. So, that's really the work of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to tell you, a huge part of the work of boundaries is forgiving yourself. I'm a 1 on the Enneagram scale.
Oh, yeah, that's
Yeah, yeah.
tough.
Yeah, yeah. Forgiving myself is not something that comes
No.
naturally. But so much of this work of awareness has led me to a place where I can be
Mm-hmm.
so much more gentle and tender with myself,
Yeah.
which as a 1 also allows me to be more gentle and tender with all of the other people in my life. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not something that I was particularly known for until recently anyway,
Yeah.
so it's made a big difference for me. So boundaries just are really hard and that's really okay. That's normal,
Yeah.
totally normal.
Another fun thing I like to tell my daughter a lot is that even my son, like the first time that you do anything is scary. When it's something new and it's something uncomfortable, Danelle, like, I don't know if you're an Enneagram 9, but I feel you, friend. She says, I think the hardest thing for me is about setting boundaries is that they destabilize things. I crave stability, AKA I kind of read that as peace, so much that I let people walk all over me in the hopes that things will just stay the same.
That's real. That's from the heart. I really
Mm.
appreciate that. Um, Boundaries do destabilize things. And what's hard is they often destabilize things in your favor.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about human giver syndrome, we have
Mhm.
not been taught to behave in ways that are in our own best interests
Yes.
or in our favor. And yeah, that's going to feel pretty weird.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you, even though I do this work every day with my clients, and I certainly do this work in my own life with boundaries, one of the things I've learned is that it's pretty much always going to be hard for me.
Yeah.
And it's like weightlifting for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Yeah. It's a
It's,
muscle.
yes. And especially like if anybody's ever done, I don't know, one of those, lifting something up off the ground before you then get into the actual exercise. Lifting something heavy up off the ground is extremely difficult to do. And you have to do it before you can do the actual exercise. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, when it comes to boundaries, that lifting something off the ground is probably feeling something pretty cruddy
Mm-hmm.
as I go into having the discussion about boundaries. It's just part of
Yeah.
the exercise for me. Knowing that that's normal for me has taken so much pressure off of me. Like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
broken because it's just really hard every single time.
Right.
Okay, it's just going to be hard every time. Fine. I can totally live with that. And my life is so much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so great. I'm excited to go back and check out that podcast. I know the holidays are particularly even triggering for some folks just because of the family dynamic. But there is so much to be gained from rehearsing, practicing, working through those boundaries, especially if you know that there's potential for conflict and you're conflict avoidant. But knowing how to deal with certain people that are even toxic within your life, familial or not, just having that as like a toolkit to me actually eases a lot of the anxiety of feeling like, okay, now I have to figure out how to deal with this person, working through it with my therapist, listening to great podcasts like yours, having sort of a script or a philosophy on how I approach this relationship as a boundary makes actually the whole interaction with those individuals that much easier. And it keeps my peace. I don't know what it does for theirs. I'm not responsible for that, but it helps me keep my peace. And to me, at the end of the day, once you are on the other side of that, Danelle, it becomes that much easier for you to reinforce that boundary if, when, and where it needs to be reinforced. To me, boundaries are the beginning of building towards stability versus letting instability rule your life. So, okay, we've got just a minute left. We didn't even get through all the questions because there's so many facets and, like I said, ways in which this human giver syndrome kind of rears its head in our lives and our careers. Anybody that's listening in our live listening audience, if you have a question, we'll hang for a minute and let you ask a question. But Kay, as folks are thinking of their questions, also you can connect with her on LinkedIn, check out her facilitator on fire.net website. What kind of final parting advice do you have for all of us human syndrome givers, whatever you call us?
Oh, you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. You didn't do anything to earn this.
Mm-hmm.
This is the way the world has worked for a long time. I mean, thousands of years.
Yeah.
And we've all inherited this from the people who came before us.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us, like I'm working to try to change the system, right? I've decided to take that on, but that doesn't have to be your job. If what you want to do every day is wake up and be a little more aware and make some decisions where you put yourself first, see what that feels like, try to find ways to cope with the discomfort that you're going to go through. That's beautiful work. And you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything to deserve or earn this. You're not being punished.
Right.
It's just relationship dynamics are really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Humans do lots of stupid things, and we have lots of habits and patterns, especially in our most important relationships, like with our spouses and at home and with our bosses. And changing those things takes time. And so it's okay to do the work, and it's okay for the work to be really hard.
Yeah. And it's work, it's practice, right? Just like meditation or anything else, it's practice. It's just going to take time and sticking to it. Okay. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing. Again, I love the language. I love the tools and the tips that you're providing. This is such a big conversation and such a big topic. I know this is not the end of it. We need to keep going. We need to keep talking. I would encourage all of you who found this helpful today, share it with somebody who needs it. Make sure that they can feel seen and heard, and then hopefully have some tools and resources as well to start to break that default. Okay. Thank you again for joining us. It's been such a pleasure. I can't believe we just met last week. I feel like we've known each other forever. I'm such a fan of all the work that you're doing and love talking with you. So thank you for joining us.
It's fantastic to be here. Thanks everybody for participating. And I can stick around for a few minutes to answer questions here if folks want to say one.
Awesome. Thank you guys. All right. Well, that's all for today then. And we will see you all next week in the lounge. Until then, keep asking, keep giving, and keep growing, friends.